We need to talk about something interesting.
And so we come at last to the final resolution in the final episode of Puella Magi Madoka Magica. It is my sincere and earnest hope in this episode, as it was at the start of this series, that I would somehow be able to convince you of the way in which I saw this show and how it resonated with me. This, I suppose, is my last desperate attempt to convince you of the validity, the power, the weight that contributes to making Madoka's Wish one of the most impactful and powerful things ever to be done, not only within the magical girl genre, but in a broader sense in animated narrative fiction, to reaffirm the values that ring axiomatically true amongst all humans across all ages. I will and do defend both Madoka and the staff of Shaft for ending this series in this way. I find it not only thematically poignant, but also a holistic way of encapsulating everything to do with the preceding 11 episodes, or perhaps it's better to say the preceding 10,000 odd episodes. As in some way what we witness here, of course, is the resolution and final statement on the magical girl genre. All of that in mind, the one comment that I will respond to before we begin the episode is that of Arch, who commented that after watching the preceding 12 episodes in this analysis series, they're very positively surprised that I somehow had not yet devolved into some type of extremist ideology ramble. Well, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but here it is. Now, keep in mind, this is absolutely a very dangerous idea, an earworm of infectious quality that will somehow burrow its way into your mind, change your life, and affect how you see the world, indeed. I'm speaking the truth to power here. I'm shedding the scales from your eyes by simply exposing it, and I can't overstate how transformative it is. You matter. Everyone, everywhere matters. Your struggles and experiences and hardships are valid and important, and you should never be made to feel that they were wasted. You should never be made to feel alone. Because even at the power level of a god, we still can't stop all bad things from happening. We can't deny you your free will to make your mistakes, to show who you are and learn and grow from it. But by seeing and understanding and appreciating what you did and how it went, we can at least always and eternally secure the validity of your experiences, ensuring that no one ever will be forgotten, and no one ever, anywhere, will ever struggle in vain. It is my hope that in episode 12 especially, we can make evident and abundantly clear that the values embodied in Madoka Kaname and the realization of her desires encased in her wish are the unequivocal and emphatic moral propaganda of this show and of the magical girl genre. We are shown the final, ultimate triumph of compassion, understanding, and appreciating other people. We are shown it in an unanswerable extreme, the ramifications of which upheave the world and recontextualize the very act of being the magical girl. It is my distinct position, and has been ever since I started this project, that the events of episode 12 affirm and empower faith, hope, and love in a way that does not remove all the suffering or evil from the world, but instead makes it wholly bearable to everyone. The message of this show, and the thing that I will put down as my propaganda, is that this applies in our real life, and through this you may be able to go on imagining a happy future. Of course, this reading is very much invited by everything that we've seen over the course of the show, and everything that happens in this episode too, so it's not too much of a crack theory, and Arch's points bring up much more detailed arguments about doing a specific reading in a textual critique critique or deriving a message from a work of art, or the intersection of art and propaganda on both the creative and the receptive ends. But keep in mind that any media with a message, anything that we would determine as art, definitely has some manipulative aspect to you. It is trying to convey something to you, and something as finely crafted and holistically pure as Madoka Magica, a series that literally ends on a message displayed on screen for its values, is obviously going to have a cogent and coherent message behind it. All of this leads to why I feel so confident in this, and why I can speak with such emphasis behind my preferred reading, why I can drink the magical girl Kool-Aid and not bat an eye, because I've encountered few things in this world so eminently clear as Madoka's wish. And let's talk about her wish. The first scene we see is, again, referencing the opening of episode 1. We are again in the full movie aspect ratio, indicating this as a flashback or a recap for what happened in episode 11. However, we go a little bit further in this scene. If you recall, in episode 11, we spoke primarily about the objective for Madoka to convince Junko to allow Madoka to take her agency back. We mentioned there that Madoka is able to do this to inspire Junko to put her faith in Madoka, and that being the reason why Junko allows and supports Madoka in her efforts. We left episode 11 on I am sorry, just as a cliffhanger, and we pick up I am sorry again at the start of this episode, but the context really isn't clear, just like it wasn't clear at the end of the last episode. The preeminent reading, I think, is that Madoka is going to disobey Homura's wishes, and she knows that. This comes after the confession in episode 11, and I think it's fairly safe that Homura is kind of interpreting the I'm sorry in that kind of way, that I'm going to betray your efforts. So we're kind of starting pretty low here, that there's some dissent amongst the two. In the same way that Madoka is betraying Junko's desire to protect Madoka, Madoka is also going to betray Homura's desire to protect Madoka. We talked about the foil last episode between Homura and Junko. So now what needs to happen here is Madoka to inspire the same degree of trust in Homura that she did in Junko in the previous episode. She needs to convince Homura, now that she understands Homura emotionally, that what she's doing not only is right, and, you know, logically we could go down the whole fucking with the genie rabbit hole, and yes, we could figure it out and parse it out and be like, well, can I wish for more wishes, etc., etc., etc. But we need to convince Homura not this, not that, you know, realistically what Madoka is doing is going to be objectively the correct play, as if you're playing Hearthstone or chess or something. We need to convince Homura on an emotional level. Just as we couldn't describe all the intricacies of everything that's going on to Junko, and yet we were still able to garner her support, the objective is to inspire the faith in Homura, and that requires not explaining everything. And indeed, Madoka has a line here that shows she doesn't even have it all worked out. The line of, I don't care what I become. The emotional aspect is triumphing over the logic here, particularly because you could never beat logic with logic's own system. The catch-22 is that if Homura and Madoka sat down and puzzled out all the ways in which they could use a wish to break the system, then Kyubey would in some way be able to have puzzled it out itself. The triumph of faith and of emotionality cannot in and of itself be born from logic. That is the only way to blindside Kyubey, is by thinking in a way that it cannot replicate. This in and of itself, the appeal to the emotions in the climax of the show, instead of appealing to any type of power, physicality, or mental acuity, is possibly the most magical girl thing possible. God, I could go on for literally hours and a half, talking about Adolescence of Utna, talking about Sailor Moon's climaxes, talking about any number of magical girl shows where the idea isn't to overpower or outsmart the enemies, but it's to outlove them or outfeel them, or just by simply trusting in yourself and acting on the belief that you want to make a happy future, and actually surrendering all the other stuff, the logic that would hold you back, the powers that have been granted to you, even your human life. You are then able to create what we would call a miracle. Does Madoka know all of this? No. Does she feel this? Yes. Her lines to Homura, again, the person she is trying to convince, I want to be a magical girl. She's always wanted to be a magical girl. Even in the first timeline, which we never see, she makes a wish to save a cat, and then just the act of being the magical girl is in and of itself the reward. The wish for mommy with the cake, the wishes all along the series. She's always just wanted to achieve magical girliness rather than use the wish to exploit some aspect of herself that she wants to emphasize. The backwards inversion here, the catch-22, is that she is the one who gets the power, the one who doesn't want it. I think the tone is very important here, that there's no element of panic like there was, say, in episode 5 when Madoka almost contracted. In episode 3, where Kyubei screams, hurry, make a wish, though this ostensibly is one of those scenes, the city is falling to pieces around them, this scene has no panic to it, because Madoka is resolved. She is calm. This is echoed in her lines of I finally know what I want to wish for. At this point, Homura objects because it would invalidate all of the effort that she put in. Now this, we know from the external point of view that this is not the case. In the same way we talked about when we talked about Dr. Faust and the natural inclination for man to strive, and that leading to a more positive and beneficial outcome, Homura's striving has led to this eventuality. It has enabled and empowered Madoka instead of creating this dead end as Homura sees it here. So we get this shot, a very loving and compassionate embrace as Madoka once again apologizes. And I read her apologies here as apologizing that Homura had to go through the amount of suffering that she did. Madoka says that Homura is the reason she is the person she is today. This gives meaning to Homura's struggle. This, in some way, is very much what Madokami will do for every magical girl ever, is simply see their pain, empathize, and validate it. Simply say that their choices were meaningful and respect them for them. Madoka outright says that she won't let Homura's efforts be in vain. Of course, it's very clear here there's no element of deception. We and Homura know that Madoka isn't even capable of something like that. And again, we kind of rely on Aoi Yuki's performance here to really sell the idea. Believe in me, she says. Of course, right now, Homura doesn't have much of a choice, left emasculated and crippled as she is. However, she doesn't protest. And indeed, this scene being a somewhat incomplete resolution for Homura finally accepting Madoka's values leads us to the naked space hug scene later on, and to the last scene pre-credits. Also, let's acknowledge that Homura still is stuck within the confines of what she believes, partly the reason why talking it out would take far too long. We have to fundamentally challenge the assumptions that Homura's made in order to make any progress here, and somebody surrendering their most deeply held beliefs and what they've based themselves off of and informed all their actions upon is a difficult and hard thing to do. It does not always logically follow that Madoka making a wish would be surrendering everything Homura worked towards. This is the linchpin that Madoka is attacking when she says, I've thought about it now, and I realized what I can do. In terms of shot composition, Madoka centralized, pulled in one way towards Kyubei, pulled in the other towards Homura, stable and leveled in a disheveled world. She breathes. A beautiful, beautiful underused technique for showing weight or emphasis and really helping the pacing of this being such a simple and small thing, but really puts in perspective of the giant destruction of Walpurgis Nacht being so inconsequential that Madoka can breathe here and collect herself and prepare herself for the biggest choice of her life. So too, when she breathes, the wind blows. The wind kicks in and brushes her hair, something something we first saw in episode 4, but continued to see again and again whenever anyone was making some sort of heavy changes or there were impacts to their actions. And Madoka voices her wish. Now, do you suppose that the actual literal meanings of words mean things? Sorry, that was a strange thing to say. What I mean to emphasize here is that the emotions that are in Madoka's heart are what are realized in her wish. So I'm going to stop short of literally calling on all the words that Madoka says to manifest her wish. Words are forever imperfect, even in magic, and I don't suppose there are magical lawyers that come by and look at the letter of the wish and not the intent. But if you would like to do a reading of how Madokami's wish rewrites Macbeth, I would love to hear it. But just a quick idea in Madoka's wish, doesn't erasing all witches further solidify what we've said, that the magical girl transformation into the witch is only a function of the despair that the person feels and not any type of magic spent idea? I do find episode 12's events pretty concrete evidence that the plot relationship between Grief Seed's healing the magical girl and the transformation into the witch when the Grief Seed darkens was always largely symbolic. I think what's important is the line after Kyubei says, "Do you intend to become a god?" Madoka, as we've said, doesn't make any wish for herself or for any power or for anything at all. She instead says all the magical girls who held on to hope, who fought against witches, I don't want them to suffer or cry anymore. I want them to be at peace. Or, in the literal Japanese, I want to see them smile, and stay smiling until the end. This is where I first tear up in this episode. Even literally watching it now for the umpteenth time, even watching it for footage, this still hits me emotionally. It's because the redefining of the scope is really important here. Not that we're blowing the lid off all of this or rewriting the universe. Madoka says in her next line that she doesn't care about any laws or any rules. She'll just rewrite them if they disagree with this. What's important is that emotion that Madoka expresses. She wants to defend, to empower, to help every magical girl, always, throughout all of time, and never let them succumb to despair. No, the scope break is because I wasn't expecting to be ripped out of the story at this exact moment. Because when Madoka says every magical girl, I understand that she's not talking about the magical girls of Mitakihara City, the magical girls designed by Ume Aoki, but she's instead fulfilling that second level diegetic wish that we saw Homura do for Madoka. She is doing what we always wanted to do as observers of the magical girl anime. Watching these stories of love and justice on the television, watching all the Sailor Senshi die in the climaxes of Sailor Moon, watching Sakura have all of her relationships put on the line, watching Fate reach out to her mother, or Hana reach out to her husband, or every other magical girl. What we wanted was always what Madoka wanted. In those moments of trial, in those moments of tribulation, we always wanted them to overcome. We wanted to know that somebody knew and supported their struggle, that across all distance and time it reached someone, it affected us, and none of it ever was in vain. I too want them to stay smiling until the end, not by changing their circumstances or removing their hardships in its entirety, because such a cheery ending would neuter them, as Homura's efforts for Madoka have shown, but instead to be beside them, knowing and appreciating each and every one of their actions, respecting them and their worldviews and their values that they fought so hard to embody and protect. In this way, we have called back and made good upon every single thing that this show has invoked, from each of the magical girls appealing to Madoka for support, to all of the mentions of things like Faust or the references to other magical girl works, all of that is subsumed and ratified in Madoka's wish, her prayer, as she says. And finally, too, we have cashed in on the idea that we mentioned in so many other episodes about the wish as fulfillment of personage. It is, yes, a reduction to throw away all the potentiality of the life that you may lead. And yet, at the same time, it is so much more that Madoka becomes. That her wish was so large of an idea that she didn't want to be a human. She didn't want to have anything. Instead, her objective choice was knowing everything, being informed, and saying that of her free will, she has determined the thing she most wants to be is hope. Because in her mind, hope matters more to her, to everyone. The ability to support, and by doing so endow everyone's choices with meaning, far outweighs anything else that she could be, that she could use her life, her potentiality towards. With even the most blank check version of adolescence thrust at her, she chooses to be, not as Mami did, alive, not as Sayaka or Kyoko did support for just one person, and not only as Homura did as a selfish mix between the two, or any of the infinite number of possibilities for who a person can be and what they can value. Madoka says in her wish that she places supporting others, ensuring that their lives have meaning and value above everything else that she can be. And in the brilliance of that moment, of the white light that pours out here, we get the title card again, symbolizing that this show, in spite of all its contrivances and deceptions, really was Puella Magi, Madoka, Magica. And the clandestine purity of Madoka's wish is where lives the eponymous heroine, where lives this show in full, and indeed where lives my very best friend. The light fades back in on a piece of cake in Mami's apartment, a symbol that shouldn't be too hard to discern. In episode 3, of course, Madoka says that she will wish for cake just simply to be a magical girl. Now she has that cake, though the circumstances are far different than Mami had expected. It's not surprising, too, that Madoka would be in Mami's apartment. It is the place where her learning about the circumstances of the magical girl first began, and it is emotionally relevant to her, as we saw in her morning scene in episode 4, and in this episode that she is required to answer to all 4 other girls. It makes sense. These were the actors on her life, the people that she fought so desperately to sympathize with and validate. She trusts their opinion, and just like Junko, just like Homura, she wants them to understand what she is doing and understand that their experiences were part of how she came to be able to make this wish. There is a very subdued reveal here, and it very generously matches episode 10. We are immediately removed from everything involving the plot and whatnot, and we are placed down looking at Madoka as a familiar voice talks off screen. While we are still realizing the cake and where Madoka is, the voice of Mami Tomoe comes in, and her symbol is shown long before we see her face. These things form an order of priority that our brains are still struggling to deal with what Madoka just said and the ramifications of that, then moving on to the fact that this is Mami. What is going on here? Mami should not exist anymore. So the tertiary thing that we notice is that Mami is questioning Madoka's resolve. Why on the first diegetic level is Mami the one to explain the ramifications of the practical reality of Madoka's wish? We could say that it is because Madoka knows that Mami, or visualizes the concepts of the magical girl world as being explained by Mami, as she did in episode 2. In this way, we could kind of see this as the realization of Madoka talking out with herself. Though I think that's kind of a heartless reading. We know that Mami Tomoe and Sakura Kyoko do exist in the world that Madoka shapes. So instead of just merely answering to the ghosts of those two, I think it's happier to think of it as answering to them, to their value systems, and earning their trust, until in the new world they have no memory of this. What do timelines and specifics mean for the rest of this episode? Really not that much. Anyway, however Mami acquires the knowledge, maybe Madoka told her before this scene started, who knows. The fact remains that Mami is presenting the reality. You're going to lose everything that constitutes your current self. This is largely not that bad for Madoka, because much like Homura, she never valued herself all that much, even as Junko and Homura both fought for her to realize it. Or perhaps it's more accurate to say that because she valued herself and understood the value of herself in her life, she understood the value of it as it applied to everyone else as well. And at the end of the day, that's all empathy really is. Seeing other people as human beings, just like you, just as valuable as you. There's a subtle difference between completely ignorant and realizing in full and still going through with the martyrdom. It is Mami's line to express the severity of what Madoka does, and in doing so also express the totality of what Madoka does. It's also one final checkpoint to make sure that Madoka has all of the information. She is not being deceived any longer, and this clearly shows that. This all ties back into the wish being a manifestation of the character becoming who they want to be. That need not be limited by any type of reality or biases that we may hold, that you need to go on living like a normal human being. No, if you want to be something broader, better, completely change the world however you can, then go do it. Live your truth, as the kids say. Very quickly, I think the overhead shot is, again, very Shinbo. I think there's a shot exactly like this in the first episode of Bakemonogatari. I don't know that I love this one, but I think it is good in putting Mami and Madoka opposed. That there is some division. That this is Mami's last challenge to Madoka's wish. Of course, that's removed later, but it's good that it's here. When Madoka confirms that she's willing to sacrifice her physical form, she segues immediately into her next line. This line is just so powerful. It's so clearly and so simply an ideology that someone can get behind with such comprehensive fullness that they would be able to look into the face of the negatives of what Mami says and say those don't even register. That's not even something that Madoka would even consider affecting her wish at all, because she can hold on to this one idea. That makes it so powerful. Believing in belief, hoping in hope. It is, of course, a catch-22. It's always been a catch-22. But it is no less powerful or true because of it. Yes, it is a tautology, but that doesn't matter, because it's nonetheless true. It's nonetheless so true that it could be the basis for not only one person's life, but one person's loss of life, the lives of everyone everywhere. It's so far above the mundanity of the world that it's not a question, it's a value. No, it's not even a value, it's an element of being human. It is a purpose. It's like when you watch a math video and someone talks about this beautiful equation and why this is so intricate and meaningful and so simple at the same time, but then you look at this and I look at this and I see, wow, this is so beautiful and so simple and so true and yet so very complex at the same time. Also consider that in these videos, I've in each Adobe Premiere file had to remove everything except of course the video files and one image. The image that I've kept is this one. I haven't removed it and I've used it in almost every episode of this because because it's been so useful, because it infects everything about the show, or that everything preceding this has led to Madoka saying this line with authority and with intent in this episode. If anything can sway you or inspire faith in Kyoko and Mami, it would be how true they feel this is to Madoka. And Kyoko, indeed, is convinced. She was always a fan of miracles and magic. Her line of reason to fight is a good way of framing it. The fights don't stop in the Madoka world. We see this very clearly. The world does not become a paradise without any evils. But so too is reason to fight synonymous with reason to live. When we asked how do we save Sayaka, give her a reason to live. Let her know she's not alone. We are convinced, as Kyoko is, that this is not a wish that is going to betray her. This is not some Kyosuke situation where she is either going to end up feeling that she was deceived, Mami already took care of that, or that she's going to end up feeling that what she is fighting for no longer matters. Because of the very simple axiomatic truth that Madoka just said, Kyoko recognizes that. So with the pair convinced, Mami, the senpai, hands Madoka that which she had abandoned in episode 4 upon Mami's death. And that is her aspirations towards becoming a magical girl. Now infused with an unshakable faith, the act of becoming the magical girl is empowered. And Mami's line here is perhaps the other moment where I'm hit the most emotionally.
You're not just giving us back our hope, but you're becoming hope itself. The hope of magical girls everywhere.
Once again, it applies broadly. It applies to all magical girls. And it's something so grandiose and so objectively positive that I'm completely floored by how crisp of a line it is. When Mami says not just giving us back our hope, does she mean Kyoko and herself? Possibly, though she could also be speaking on behalf of all magical girls. Giving us back our hope, implying that they're giving them a validity, they're giving them a reason to keep fighting. Stuff that we very clearly see later on. But you're becoming hope itself. Urobuchi makes it extremely clear what is going on for Madoka. We are invited to read this thematically because Mami brings it to that level. We are also invited to read this on a more genre level because Mami brings it that way in this line. Could we read this, yes, as the absolute end of the magical girl genre, but also in some ways the beginning of the genre as well? That even in the face of all the systems that would come to oppose the girls, not a one would ever truly be alone or ever truly fall into despair, because there was always hope for a better future, for a positive outcome. Or maybe in some way there's no chronology to it that comes along with what Madoka's wish is. The concept of hope doesn't have a beginning or an end. It only has a real, tangible presence forever and always. And trusting in it and recognizing it allows for miracles and magic to exist. Back in the canonical timeline, we have the radiance and the sparkles as both Kyubei and Homura are blinded by the light of Madokami. Effortlessly and still, she brings up the rosewood bow, now grown into full bloom, as Madoka has finally bloomed, and also now very clearly in the entwined version of the staff of Asclepius, the ancient Greek god of healing. There are flames as she draws her bow, something we would associate with burning, with passion, with Homura, indeed, as again her name means to burn. And then we have the overwhelming power of her attack, right? The million arrows in the sky. A few other examples that I'll mention here but not touch on very deeply are that you can certainly interpret Madoka in episode 12 as Bodhisattva and in a Buddhist lens, and I think there's a great argument for this. Certainly the show mentions karma often enough. I'll put a link below to a good interpretation of this. Furthermore, Or take, for example, her sigil in the sky. I think there's reasonable evidence to interpret this as the Kabbalah from Jewish mysticism. Again, I found somebody not 2 months ago who is putting forth this interpretation. Check out the link to read more. Of course, this famously was referenced also in the end of Evangelion, and Madoka certainly has a lot of influences in episode 12 that feel very end of Evangelion, from something as small as this tree of life to something as large as rewriting the entire world. But again, I know less about those than I probably should. What I can tell you with some authority, though, is that now that Madoka has fulfilled her desire to become somebody who is in support of these certain ideals, she has communicated here, she has empathized, she has truly made viable her desires to love and support others. In this way, she is granted the power that Homura lacked. In fact, this scene is a direct contrast to the fight against Walpurgis Nacht we saw in episode 11. For all the extreme effort that Homura went through, she wasn't able to make a foot of progress. And now, with one simple, effortless act, Madoka literally carries away the gray skies, replacing them with a pure and clean blue. This is kind of why I dislike fight scenes. Thematically is Madoka's desire to believe in hope at all costs stronger than the hatred that all the witches had for their circumstances? Is it more than the despair held in the hearts of all magical girls who are about to become witches? And the statement that the show makes here so cleanly, so obviously, is that of course it is. It's not even close. We are shown, yes, that love triumphs over logic, but we are also shown that love triumphs handily, always, over despair. And it's so simple and so clean and so obvious that it could never be otherwise, because we know it and believe it to be so. And the statement made by episode 11's fight scene contrasted with this one is simply how effective this is at solving this problem by attacking it in a completely different manner. And the existence once known as Madoka Kaname, it's kind of like the artist formerly known as Prince, is only the manifestation by which this is carried out. And we see that here, shots of various other magical girls from across human history. Yes, again, we see Cleopatra and Anne Frank and Joan of Arc, but also too some other magical girls from the future, from the indiscriminate past, or from larger social events that could have possibly happened. For example, the first girl is ostensibly a Himalayan princess, according to the wiki, who has her own backstory about sealing evil spirits away. All of this is so very clearly to represent any other magical girl outside of the scope of these 5 that we've seen. Puella Magi, Madoka Magica, and Shaft here are trying deliberately to remove the bounds of Madoka Magica, and had they the rights to use Pretty Cure or Sailor Moon characters here, I guarantee you there would be. Because this is nothing other than just a representation of both the real-world circumstances that tend to end up as climatic moments in magical girl fantasy shows. Stories of fiction are just as prevalent and meaningful as what we see in our real lives. Yeah, Cleopatra was a real person, but for those who care for stories, she will always be remembered, not purely in her historical context, but in the fantasy of Cleopatra, much the same as all the rest. Simply because no human ever existed in the real world called Usagi Tsukino, this changes nothing about the fact that Sailor Moon has had more of an impact on our lives and our value systems than almost any other person alive. At least, that is, for your magical girl fan. If you're interested more on this, look up the philosophy of Jacques Lacan, as specifically as interpreted by the book Beautiful Fighting Girl by Saito Tamaki. There's some very interesting stuff about the realities and layers that fiction presents, and how the layers of fiction blur between real life, quote-unquote real life, and that presented in our works of fiction. So then, as the swells of the redemptive orchestra can be heard, the song, of course, Sagitta Luminis, or in Latin, Arrow of Light, we hear the modulation in this song deep into it. A quick summary I found, again, in the links below on the music theory behind it, but this modulation gives it this swell as Madoka saves the Himalayan girl, and we see the smile on her face as we, placed in Madoka's view, zoom out, infused with this suddenly more hopeful attitude solely because of Kajiura's efficacy. We know intrinsically what's going on is a positive, and the variation here shows it as all-encompassing, and as each of the girls is saved in turn from a war zone, from the Sahel, from being burned alive at the stake, from the unspecific future, we contextualize some things. Madoka has voice lines over this too. First, their efforts are not undone. Again, that's not what Madoka wished for. This in some way is a bittersweet ending because all the curses and negatives of humanity don't suddenly stop existing. The girls all die. The main idea is that no one dies alone. So too is the change that they never give up on their wish. Madoka's line is that they never stop believing, even until the very end. This is transformative, of course, on the system because it means that this whole equivalency factor that has been parroted by Kyoko and by Sayaka and by Kyubei doesn't matter, doesn't have an effect. A witch will not be born that curses as much as the magical girl hoped or helped. This is assuring that the world can live in this paradox, that the positive values the magical girls have always represented and will always represent can last and apply and have influence and meaning in our real world. Again, I want to harken back to the idea that this has always been the case, and whether this is a reaffirmation or the establishment of that concept doesn't matter one way or the other. In fact, I think it's both at the same time. This is why Madoka has been and always will be the patron saint of magical girls, or any of those of us who dare to believe in miracles and magic and the value of positivity, compassion, and empathy. It's entirely why this is no deconstruction. In its final moments, Madoka Magica has proved to be somewhat less subversive than we were initially set up to believe. Instead, it's quite standardly affirming everything that has ever gone on in any magical girl show ever, or any tangentially magical girl-esque experience in the real world. For, as we've said, those two are much the same. Those, of course, all matter and do have an influence because we were there to see them. We were there to value the experiences of the heroines and understand, encourage, and support them. So too is this exactly what Madoka says to the witches that constitute Walpurgisnacht, or should I say, the magical girls who gathered to form Walpurgisnacht. All of their pain, all of their negative ramifications for their good deeds, all of this is paradoxically and unfairly removed by Madoka, removed by the hope for a better future. The next scene, I think, is both very necessary for understanding the mechanical side of what's happening with the world, giving us who have seen this kind of the tangible, crunchy resolution to everything resulting from the hope of Madoka's wish, that is seeing a true miracle have power. But also simultaneously, it's the resolution we talked about earlier of Homura and her learning to accept Madoka's agency and further understand her wish. Without this scene here, it becomes very difficult to kind of understand why Homura would be the ardent pro-Madoka supporter that we see symbolized in the later scenes. Mentioning briefly the connection between these two things happening in the same scene gives some sort of legitimacy to a reading that Homura needs this resolution. She needs to be explained this resolution for her to be able to move on. That her thoughts are so grounded in the tangible. She really needs this transformation explicated to her in a very concrete way. Whereas I think this scene is almost somehow skippable, and I could almost go directly into Sayaka's scene here. I mean, Kyubei just has a ton of expository dialogue, and it seems like Urabuchi kind of has the need to explain things in a very systemic way. And I think that if this were not the particular type of magical girl show that it is, if this were a more, I don't know, what do we call it, Precure-esque magical girl show, then the ending would be a bit more like Hugto Pretty Cure, and a bit less like Psychopaths or Fate or whatever. There's a hyper-real, ethereal vibe here, of course. It's very 2001 A Space Odyssey Star Child thing. Or generally, this is how we would conceptualize this type of universe-altering situation. Though I suppose you could just as much draw from End of Evangelion or some other sci-fi classics. Some behind-the-scenes interviews talk about how Urobuchi didn't write anything for the setting, and it was just left to the directors at Shaft to interpret whatever this setting would be. Homura awakens on a white plane, ostensibly the moon, and a pure black background. We touched very much on color theory a while ago, and I particularly like in episode 12 the representation later of Homura Akemi, as it emphasizes more her purpleness, also very much featuring the red ribbon very heavily. Here though, she's very much associated with this black and white dichotomy. It's something we talked a lot on in other shows like Adolescence of Utena, and it generally means, when used in fiction, that there's two things. There's a black and a white. There's no gray in between them. But this shouldn't be a difficult symbol to come to terms with. We talked about it in the first scene of this series. So a callback in some way to that liminal space, but also sort of a callback to the mindset, the ideology that would keep a magical girl trapped in the system, the black and the white. If we extend this kind of backwards, in episode 11, which featured a ton of gray, there was a bunch of Madoka making her wish, or seeing the circumstances, or whatever have you. Or maybe there's even a room for reversal of this reading, saying that Madoka is putting things in black and white, that hope always prevails against the darkness. There definitely is this paradoxical idea that the only absolute is that nothing is absolute. There are no lines in the sand, and everything has to be taken on a case-by-case, impossible to judge basis. So maybe the best representation of the world isn't black or white or gray, but really the multicolored rainbow we see later in the scene. We've seen Madoka kind of be associated with the white in this episode, and the full raiment of Madokami is certainly going to further that idea. Now I've got myself all mixed up, and maybe it's a good example of a symbol that is just deliberately obscure. Or perhaps it's simply just to say there's nothing to focus on here, there's no setting. Deliberately so that we focus on what's happening. I really don't love Kyubey narrating this. Again, I kind of feel that it could be either implied or just left for the viewer to assume. With its first explanation, it shows the soul gem, and it mentions the idea that Madoka is creating a new universe, so an old universe must be destroyed. Kind of like this last grasp, this putting Kyubey as the ultimate arbiter, even in this type of situation, that its ideas of equality are going to triumph here, even with the weight of Madoka's wish brought to bear. I just honestly absolutely love the animation of everything that happens in this scene. The harsh blacks being used in this very strained, very forceful way of these blurry highlights that give everything this kind of malicious context. If you are given the task of animating a curse, what does that even look like? But wispy black strands and ever-changing outlines really give it that effect. Of course, The Last Witch is also familiar to us in the realm of Gekidan Inukuri's designs that we've seen throughout the series. And it's wonderfully abstract and completely imposing in exactly the same way. Homura, our ostensible lens for seeing this scene now, informs us of how we are to react to this. She's in abject terror. The curses, the witches haven't been removed, they've only been remade into this one form, and she's seeing it hold the earth in its grasp. She's utterly terrified now that everything has failed. What she so desperately tried to prevent happening has, in its extremity, still come to pass. There's still a negative outcome for Madoka's wish, for her fate, even in the rewriting of this universe. It was all a lie. She shouldn't have trusted Madoka if it was just going to come to this. In many ways, this is the last timeline that goes at the end of episode 10. This is Homura's inescapable prison come to bear. But then, all of that is undone. The first part of this scene, the collection of the curses throughout all of time and of the genre, were all just focalized into one girl. However, that girl is now Hope. and all the curses just cumulatively add up into despair. These are just concepts now, but the fact remains, the paradoxical, impossible fact is that hope always overcomes despair. And Madoka, now the embodiment of hope, will never fall into despair. And so then, effortlessly, she can undo all the despair, all the purposelessness, all the absurdities of the world that humans have to struggle with to cope with their realities, all of the things that would allow for and lead to someone giving up on life. Those are completely destroyed. This is the ultimate reality of life and the ultimate reality of what we see in the magical girl. Through this, you may be able to imagine a happy future, or through this, you might be able to go on living happily. For those of you who say, how can hope paradoxically eliminate despair? I say to you, how could it not? I did warn you this was going to get preachy. But in some way, that's why you're watching the show, right? You're finding something true about the world, about our lives, and about our experiences living in it. This is what they're saying is the truth. It is the system that we have spent 11 episodes being so ingrained in, being ultimately overthrown in one paradoxical act. And though many will struggle with this, and many have struggled with this, again, temporality is not our concern. All magical girls will eventually find this truth that Homura sees in this scene. Life is always meaningful, and it's always worth living. On a more personal note, one of the figures that I own and I feature prominently in my house is that of Ultimate Madoka, and I made a very big effort to get this figure and display it prominently because this represents this truth that I find so axiomatic, and it just reminds me so much in her design. I think we've touched on that already before, of all the characters that they have sometimes at the end of the Pretty Cure season where it's just this spirit. It's not even really a character, but more of a representation of hope and belief and positivity in fighting on for a purpose. If you ever need a symbol to represent this idea, then there's nothing more perfect than the magical girl fully realized. Because, as the box says, it is ultimate. And it's indisputably the last word of this genre and this show. And I just love the representation more than anything else. Well, more than anything else except what happens to Homura after this scene. I always love when artsy animation is used effectively, like the high-quality explosions or Homura getting blown away by the light of the explosion. It does a great job of selling the impact of what just happened. And now the setting subtly shifted here into this miasma of stardust. It's all pink and abstract in a way that the previous setting very much wasn't. And again, I might be off base, but the upside-down naked silhouettes remind me primarily of the Evangelion opening and ending. In a lot of ways, this is the Tang scene of this show, featuring giant naked Madoka. Or if it's not a direct reference, we're still in the subliminal space in between different realities, and that's very clear. Everything we said earlier about the previous scene still matters. Madoka still needs to convince Homura to believe in faith, to put her trust in Madoka's agency. I still don't love Kyubei being the one explaining here. Though again, I suppose it's more necessary for Homura than anything else. Again, a very clear color reading here that Homura's rejection of everything that just happened was in complete monochrome and fades to black. But the multifaceted rainbow of colors that Madoka brings with her symbolizes how this multicolored, multifaceted way of thinking replaces Homura's binary. I also very much enjoy the witch's text floating around in the background. It kind of goes along with the Antony that we saw earlier, right before Madoka destroyed all the despair. Anyway, as Homura says this is a fate worse than death, Madoka says that's not true. it isn't. But before explaining why it isn't, she comes to Homura on this emotional level. Remember, Homura's biggest fear is that all of her efforts would have been in vain. That which she defined herself as, the task that was her identity, would ultimately be meaningless. Madokami first addresses this kind of emotional crux to Homura, stating that though she believed in it in episode 11 and while making her wish, after trusting in the emotions that she received from Homura, now she has the proof that that trust was not misplaced. She sees literally everything that Homura went through over the decades of her fight. In this small act, Madoka demonstrates not only her omniscience, sure, but a level of compassionate understanding that exemplifies exactly what she does for all magical girls. And this too we see in the Sayaka scene following this. Again, very true to the core magical girl experience. I'm thinking of Duck saying, "But that's not how you really feel. Tell me how your emotions go." Or, God, any magical girl will do this. This is again this kind of backwards thinking that we use to arrive at this point. You feel first, and then that allows you to resolve the issues. Madoka's line that now becoming what I am and seeing this, I realize that you truly were my very best friend. In this way, she's kind of giving Homura this validity of identity. We talked in episode 10, does Homura want to become powerful? Does Homura want to save Madoka? Does she just simply want to be on the level of respect that Madoka is? Now perhaps all she really wanted was a friend. That's why this scene is so hard and bittersweet, because Homura really wanted and treasured this relationship. And now, though granted and though justified, it's not going to exist in the way that she expected it to. However, moving into these next lines of dialogue, there's no more talk of it all being wasted or Homura panicking, because Madoka has done the work to validate her efforts. Very much in line with the De Beauvoir quote we brought up earlier in the series. Now it's just the fact of Homura reconciling Madoka's agency, contrasted against Homura's own selfish desires for this ostensible friendship. So what's the answer to that? The line of "you'll be alone forever," and Madoka saying that's not the case. That's not the correct way of looking at it. She won't be alone forever. She will be with everyone forever. We touched on the idea of a new, more special kind of happiness, endowed upon those who are thrust into these glamorous magical positions, even at the cost of that everyday grace. And indeed, in my panel on grace and glamour, you find often in the climax of the Magical Girls series that grace and glamour, that is the everyday and the enjoying the people around you, and the glamour of what happens in your life and your calling to be who you want to be and live the life that you want to lead, those two often, though they seem to contrast, they don't have to. Though Madoka, yes, knowingly sacrificed the normative experience of the schoolgirl, she gained a new, normal, graceful happiness that is in orders of magnitude more different and yet somehow just as special and fresh. And this in and of itself is not a loss, just simply a change. Madoka's ideology established a couple more things about this scene we need to talk about. This is in and of itself a miracle that Homura remembers Madokami. That is never stated in this show other than Madoka's line of "maybe you'll be able to remember me," but I think it's pretty clearly true with just what we see in the next couple scenes, and Madoka ending on the idea that miracles can happen sometimes. Furthermore, we have this naked space hug. If we're generous, we can kind of say that it is in reference to like magical girl transformations with the silhouettes of their naked bodies and something we see in the intro. If we're not, we can kind of just say it's a tonal thing for the idea or concept of this occurring outside of space and time. But either way, the abstractness of these two girls embracing naked definitely strikes some big Yuri vibes. In like kind of the end of Adolescence of Utna, with Utna and Anthe naked together on the remnants of the car. Of course, for the purposes of this reading, we're not too concerned about the sexuality sexuality of Madoka or Homura. Though, once again, there's obviously plenty to support this reading, and you shouldn't be hard-pressed to find one out there on the internet. But we would be remiss not to say the intimacy of this scene, and largely what it's going for tonally, feels very familiar with what we've seen from many other magical girls. And so we actually arrive at one of my last points for the naked space hug scene, and that is this is kind of in direct reference to the final episode of the first season of Lyrical Nanoha. If you'll remember, again directed by Shinbo. And here you want a clip of the English dub featuring, yes, Christina V, Homer's voice actress as Nanoha.
Oh, babe! Thank you, Nanoha. Even though we'll be apart, I'm sure we'll see each other soon. And when we do, can I call you by your name again? When I want to see you, I'll call your name. Nanoha, I want you to call my name too. And if something's ever bothering you, just remember this. I will always be there for you.
Poignant, no? Anyway, the scene on the bridge in this last episode of Nanoha has almost an unnerving similarity to this scene here, down to the position of the embrace of the two, and the dialogue that's spoken of first addressing the emotional issues, and then surely seeing the person again sometime. With this in mind, we kind of get a more colored reading of, the sexuality of this scene, considering that Nanoha Takamachi and Fate Testarossa are possibly the most explicitly lesbian couple that would exist in anime until Symphogear was made, and even then, Hibiki and Miku don't have a kid together. The last thing to kind of really seal this one as a direct allusion is the exchange of the ribbon. Again, the ribbon symbol, something we talked about in episode 1 for Madoka valuing herself and her appearance, and something that definitely comes up as a bookend in episode 12 with the Junko scene. But yes, in the Nanoha scene, they exchange each other's hair ribbons, which they then wear for the rest of their franchises, just as Homura continues to wear the red ribbon from Madoka. In this way, the ribbon kind of has a dual symbol meaning to it, or even a 3-layer one. It's a red string of fate, certainly. It's also this element of promise that Homura can rely on to make sure that it was all not just a dream, a tangible memento of everything that happened, and again, miraculous that she even has it, but it also retains all the meaning that it had in episode 1. In the same way that Junko gave the ribbon to Madoka, saying, you should be aware of how much your life is worth, and you should value yourself and your existence very highly. Madoka now gives the ribbon to Homura in much the same way, with the same message of intent. Homura, who went in the start of this whole endeavor from being someone completely, ostensibly worthless, to someone who reduced herself for one singular purpose, instead now receives this hard to understand and hard to bear message of go and be a full person, live a full life. Not just for another, but for and of yourself. Find who you really are, and value it. Understandably, that's a lot for, a 4-minute scene, so the next couple scenes after Sayaka are her learning to accept that. It's too bad that Madokami deleted the witches from Macbeth, otherwise there could have been a very good quote.
When shall we three meet again? In thunder, lightning, or in rain?
When the hurly-burly's done, when the battle's lost and won.
So we transition back into some form of reality. It's good to see this show still has in its heart this setup of just show an establishing shot, then zoom in as a little pacing break. I don't know that I have a good reading for the lampposts here. Maybe the strings of fate, once again, kind of all evened out now. I think that fits very nicely with Homura's mindset leveling out, as Homura has been associated with the lampposts a couple times now. Or perhaps now it's used in reference to the bus stop scene in episode 8, where we saw a shot of some lampposts before we saw Madoka and Sayaka argue for the last time. Irregardless, the lines on their lens flares being horizontal has this level-headedness, has this placidity to it, that is echoed with what we see in the scene. Another symbol coming back here is kind of this bright orange that we famously saw in episode 5 when Sayaka listened to Kyosuke perform on the roof. It's been associated a couple times throughout the show with these halcyon days that the girls now literally look back on fondly. We shouldn't need much of an explanation for the song that Kyosuke plays or that Hitomi watches him with a true earnestness and passion. However, I think the directing quite sublimely sublime here, focusing on Kyosuke, on the judges in a darkened theater, and then after some 15 seconds focusing then on the spotlight with Sayaka and Madokami. The camera also actually doing a complete 180 to kind of pull out off Kamijo, turn around, and then zoom in on the girls. Their dialogue here is not anything out of the realm of anything that we haven't said already in this episode. After talking about these abstracted girls, after talking about the genre at large, now we're placed back here with the character we experienced the most of this story with. The character by which and with which we experienced the descent into despair and the abandonment and betrayal of the wish. But it's not that any longer, and is, so far divorced from the emotions of the moment and the experiences of episodes 7 and 8. Sayaka, having been understood by Madoka, Sayaka is then contented with her wish and accepts the ramifications of it. Just like all the magical girls, she is not absolved of all of her hurt and her pain and her emotions and her choices. She simply has somebody there to say that those were extremely difficult situations to be put in and to support her passions and her thoughts. That's literally what Madoka says here. Let's go a bit line by line because I think there's a translation oddity that really makes it seem a bit different in the Japanese than it does in the English. Specifically, there's a use of the perfect tense and potentiality that I think maybe gets a little bit hard to translate in a way that might affect how you see this scene in English. The subtitles translated as the only way I could save you would be to make it like none of this had happened. However, in English, Madoka presents the hypothetical of saving Sayaka and, preventing her eventual death through the line, in order to save you, I have to. Now, Madokami's still speaking in the hypothetical here. That is, in order to save you, I would have to erase all of this. She does, with her next line, kind of clarify that position with a very quick, but if I do that. However, I think that just changing that first line would remove any of the ambiguity left in there. This kind of future tense ambiguity matches largely with the Japanese that doesn't really distinguish between the future tense and the present tense, mostly implying which one they're meaning with context. However, the context is very vague here. So when Madokami says,
そしたら、この未来も消えてなくなっちゃうの。
the ADR director would have to be very much aware of the context for what Madokami means, as this can mean the future will disappear, or the more ambiguous, this future disappears, present tense. And then there's even further subtleties too with the potentiality being translated. We have this future would have to disappear in the subtitles, and Madoka in the English dub says this future will have to disappear. Again, slight but meaningful changes. It seems a bit weird because they don't have to match any lip flaps right here, but who knows, maybe a professional translator could be able to speak on it more. This is largely in the context of the special exemptions of the Madokami, because Madoka as a person will never exist. She was a large reason why Sayaka contracted in the first place, and removing Madoka as a person opens up a couple potentialities for what Madokami wants to do with the four, but primarily the two magical girls that made a wish on account of interacting with Madoka Kaname. So that's just what this scene is here. It's Madoka first and foremost emotionally supporting what Sayaka did and what she went through, and understanding everything about her relationship with Kyosuke now, as omniscient as she is. Apologizing, of course, in the same way as she did to Homura, that she didn't really understand her while she was a human. Saying that she now sees everything and completely values the choices that Sayaka expressed under the world, and that they were valuable. She literally says this, but she ultimately leaves it up to Sayaka. Does Sayaka want to rescind everything having to do with being a magical girl? Or now, at the end of everything, does she actually believe in that wish? And does that become something that she is okay sacrificing her existence for? And it's such a powerful answer. Indeed, the answer is definitively yes. I think it's powerful because it says that things don't have to work out correctly. correctly, or even in the way that you had planned for things to improve. That even though it may seem to you as an objective failure of a wish, of an experience, it's quite not the case. In fact, it's almost exactly not the case. That even her miserable emotional mess of her relationship with Kyosuke and the wish that she made seems like a logical failure. It's not about the failure, it's not about the objectiveness of the situation, but more about the emotional growth of Sayaka. And the reason that this is so poignant of a scene is that we see Sayaka here okay with herself and with her decisions, and understanding that though she did make an emotional wish, she knows that's who she was at the time. She respects that she learned from those experiences, and whether or not she goes on fighting in the physical world doesn't really matter. What matters is that those emotions were real, those choices were impassioned, and once again it was more about her journey than her destination. And this one too, we actually have a Word of God quote from an interview with Gen Urobuchi. He was asked that there were rumors that Shinbo asked to change the ending of this series to make it happier. Urobuchi states that Shinbo proposed at one of the dubbing sessions that Sayaka Miki could have been kept alive in the story, but it was Urobuchi's conviction that in order for the audience to really understand why Madoka became a god in the end, it was important that Sayaka die. And I largely agree with Urobuchi. If Madokami does undo all of this, then it really does remove a lot of the thematic weight behind the idea of accepting and valuing yourself and of your wish and your past as a representation of who you wanted to be and striving to work towards that. And I think it has a religiosity to it in a way that very much did at the end of episode 9. That death isn't this finality. It's just more so that Sayaka is now done with being a magical girl, or she's moved on to that next battle, having grown and learned and valued her time and her experiences. And as a final statement saying that her wish was true and her experiences were real, she doesn't betray them in the end. And of course the fan service that we see of Sayaka Miki in Rebellion and how very awesome she is in that all stems from the empowerment of the weight of her choices in this final episode here. But I think that's largely a conversation for another video. Of course, the visual symbols, again the tears with Sayaka, very, very crucial to her and very important to her symbology with the water and everything. Especially here we see the shots of the tears running down her face in the end of episode 8, matching as well the bloody tears in her fight with Elsa Maria, and the teardrop symbol that we saw in episode 9 when Kyoko and Madoka teamed up to save her. And yeah, here again we have this large question of how do we save Sayaka Miki? Maybe if we don't save her up front, we can save her after the fact. And what Madoka does here is simply that. The scene ends very nicely though with what's ostensibly another temporal skip. Again, time doesn't really mean anything in this episode. Ave Maria ends to Kyosuke performing in front of a huge crowd, and then a flashback to the open window and the wind, again associated with Sayaka's wish. All those scenes in the hospital room in episodes 3 and 4 and the like, and him just very briefly saying her name. Sayaka's choice at the end here to respect her wish and everything that she went through leads very nicely into the scene on the train station in what is ostensibly the new world, coming in medias res, right after the wraith dissolves in a fire. The callback on this one pretty obviously to be that episode 10 timeline where Mami shoots everyone, which if you'll remember contains Octavia's face being dissolved by flame in exactly the same way. Two really good bits of writing here for both Mami and Kyoko. Mami saying the law of the cycles, it's only natural. I believe there's a quote from Urobuchi stating he didn't really intend for the law of the cycles to become this big thing. It was kind of just this throwaway proper noun that he gave to this idea here in episode 12, but then through the power of mimetic mutation or fan theories that became kind of like this identity and a second way of describing the spirit of hope that Madoka turns into. It's not to say that the word of God trumps the fan interpretation here, not at all. Just mostly to say that I don't know how Law of the Cycles really fits with the idea of hope that Madokami becomes, but I think it really fits with the idea of how Mami looks at the world and how she goes on living. She is a very ordered person, and as we said in previous episodes, is very willing to buy into the systems that she's put in. So a concept like the Law of the Cycles would be very attractive to someone like Mami. The other good directing and writing moment is Kyoko pounding the the pipe, having a line saying what good was saving the guy she loved if she vanished herself. And it's just going back to that idea that Kyoko and Sayaka kind of coming from the same place, but having different views on the world, and then reconciling those views, or this idea that sacrificing yourself for one idea is kind of anathema to what Kyoko has built her self-identity on, and that changes her in a positive way. We just see it furthered here, even in this timeline. And again, it gives more weight to Sayaka's decision not to have Madoka rescind everything that happened in Sayaka's life, further enabling the resolution scene between the two in Madoka Rebellion. Also really love this shot here of the checkerboard, implying back to the first opening scene of the show that there's a labyrinth that they still have to manage. There's still a system of good and bad and everything in between. There's also these pillars between each of the girls that kind of cut them off or compartmentalize them in this shot. They each have a different take on whatever happens, and they are drawn so that they're not looking at each other. Furthermore, there's a large imbalance with this pillar right in the center of the shot, implying that there should be someone on the left with Mami, making it feel a bit empty, echoing the loss that they're feeling right now of Sayaka. Then, of course, we very easily transition into the ribbons that Homura remembers Madoka and what a miracle that is, making very clear that neither Kyoko nor Mami remember Madoka Kaname. And the scene very abruptly ends with two close-up shots of Mami and Kyoko, implying that that was something very core to them, or that Madoka's name kind of hit them in a way that they may not remember or may not be clear, but still triggers some type of vacuous emotional space that they're not even consciously aware of. But then the darkness and grays of that shot completely disappear abruptly, and we're met with the sunset on the riverbank. The light staccato piano gives it a real soft feel, and it matches very nicely as we're introduced to Tatsuya's drawing. It shouldn't be any surprise to us or hard to take at all that a child like Tatsuya would be able to understand or envision Madoka. In a realm of hope and faith and innocence, none are more powerful than a child. Even just outside of the contemporary database, literally Jesus said, "Let the little children come to me, because the kingdom of God belongs to people like these." Or, if you would rather, Ikahara, when speaking on Utena as naive, in quite possibly my favorite quote of all time. To put it nicely, this is why Utena is naive and foolish, why she speaks of her prince and the like at her age. To our sensibilities, we think of that as stupid, but I want to show that this sensibility of ours, that leads us to think of that as stupid, is itself absurd. Urobuchi himself makes a comment that wouldn't strike any of us as rare or unique, that Tatsuya will likely outgrow the concept of Madoka and stop being able to see or know her. But it just so happens that one person won't. Even with the faculties and logic of an adult, they still irrationally believe, and they find things like imaginary friends and miracles just as natural as anything else in the world. I can't overstate how much I like the representation of Homura Akemi in these final few scenes. It starts with her here, first, of course, wearing the ribbon that she has accepted Madoka's gift that was originally from Junko, with all the symbolic weight that has behind it, something we previously touched on. I love just aesthetically how much it does for her character design. She looks substantially different than she did before, and the red accenting her natural purple is such a unique look. There's something to be said for the monochrome aesthetics of a magical girl, and it's only very, very rarely that we break this kind of established setup with differing or contrasting colors. And now, with Homura featuring much more purple than she had previously, the always highlighted red bears this burden of something that doesn't match, that's not originally hers, that she always carries with her. Tatsuya clearly understands. Also note how Homura's general demeanor doesn't match either of the representations that we've seen for her so far in this series. She's not a cowering, worthless human being like she was in the first timelines of episode 10, and she's not an off-putting, haughty, inapproachable person. She speaks too with an element of relaxed nature to her voice. And even in this situation, she indulges Tatsuya, of course about Madoka, but the simple fact that she takes the time to engage him, it's just a behavior that we haven't seen from Homura yet, and very concrete evidence that she's changed to be somebody new. This too is largely the context for this scene, something that was alluded to in the foil in episode 11, something that was even alluded to back in the scene with Madoka drinking with Junko back in episode 6. Heck, something that was alluded to back in that bathroom scene in episode 1 when Junko told Madoka her life should have some value and act like it does. Again, Homura never met Junko Kaname, kind of like that Utena thing at last we meet for the first time. And almost everything Junko said in this series directly applies to Homura's plight, so there's kind of this liminal space between these relationships, and the one that we haven't even spoken of, the one that has been mysteriously absent and in the subtext only, is this one right here. Remember also that Junko placed her faith in Madoka to do what she needed to do, and when we last saw Homura, she was struggling to do the same. However, the ribbons functioning for this symbol are brought up by Junko here. Even through the veils of a new universe, Junko realizes this is something her daughter would be associated with if she had one. And Homura smiles at that. In this way, she's wearing those ribbons. She's finally getting that affirmation from Junko that she never really knew that she needed, but that she's behaving in a way, or she's now embodying the values that Madoka embodied while she was alive. That somehow Homura is this XP for Madoka, that she's become her avatar, her prophet, right? And she's content with this. She's received Junko's benediction, and that transitively means that Homura is now who Junko would have wanted Madoka to be. A few other quick hits about this scene. Again, we have this effusive light, very warm and inviting, and the soft piano continues. The translation, again, a little bit weird. In response to Junko saying it's an imaginary friend that Tatsuya has thought up to play with when he's alone, Homura says, "Oh yes, I remember as well." In Japanese, she doesn't attach an object to this. She doesn't say what she remembers. The subtitles add in the object of her, indicating Madoka, which makes sense as Junko's next line is that, is she a character from an anime or something? But in the English dub, Homura just says, I remember doing that as well. I'm a bit split on both of these translations, because while the context does seem to imply that she remembers Madoka, that is what Junko assumes. So perhaps the English dub line is a bit more true to the actual circumstances, leaving Junko to be the one that first brings it back to the specific person and not just imaginary friends in general. However, both of these English translations kind of destroy the ambiguity. In Japanese, Homura could be implying an object of Madoka, or she could be implying an object of the imaginary friend. Because she doesn't say which one she remembers, it's almost very deliberate in how she prods Junko to fill in that blank. This goes largely along with how Homura presents herself in this scene. She obviously humors Junko, but she doesn't go forward, she doesn't be assertive, and she doesn't proactively offer things. It's more like she's trying to convey, without telling Junko that Madoka did all this and, burdening her with what actually happened and that she remembers, she's trying to confirm to Junko that Madoka's values and ideas are meaningful and resonant and remain in this world, and that everything that Junko did for Madoka mattered. It's like she's the angel for Madoka, literally the messenger for Madoka, come to tell her mother, you did a good job. But again, it's the emotional affirmation there that Junko did a good job, not the actual logical affirmation. In this way, Homura has kind of learned. She's grown. She's learned not to speak in things in absolutes. She's learned to care about people's feelings, and she's learned the power of just supporting them. In this moment, she is acting like Madoka. Also, we have here one of the last instances of the diegetic distance idea that we've brought up again and again all the way from episode 1, and it's humorously done as a fourth wall breaking thing, which, oh god, it's kind of just as classless here as it is in Symphogear, but at least this show did have some thematic weight to it. Isn't that what we've said already, that anime and real life and stories don't have any meaningful differentiation when it comes to these values and these ideas? I mean, Madoka's literally a concept right now. Does it matter if she ever existed or not? The other reference here is that they're on the banks of the river, and Junko stretches in much the same way that Sayaka did back then. Maybe not the strongest correlation, but I think it's meaningful to bring up Sayaka's mindset in episode 5. We just came off that scene saying that everything was worthwhile and that even knowing what she knows now, Sayaka would have still made the same choice. If we're evoking that scene and that ideology, isn't it meaningful that Junko and Homura too feel the same way? They are now confident in themselves and they know that they would make the same choice because the experiences made them who they are. And they can trust in that and believe it was worthwhile and meaningful. I think the last thought is of peace, acceptance, and understanding of the struggle. And now Homura, dealing with that, talks it out to Kyubey over a shot of a full healed moon, so different than the crescents we saw earlier in the series. Absurdly massive too, like it's the ending scene of the 200th episode of Sailor Moon or something. And symbolically, we see Homura high above things, up where Kyubey sat at the end of episode 8, and now a little less like a gargoyle and a little more like a Batman, protecting a living and vibrant city down below. Again, this scene in Kyubey's dialogue is a little too Urobuchi explaining things for my taste, but there's one very good element in all this expository dialogue, and that's there's no way to determine if that's just your memories or if that all actually happened. This is exactly what we've been saying with the diegetic distance throughout. It doesn't matter one way or the other if this entire story was just Homura's massive way of coping, or her Yuri fanfic that she wrote for herself, because the unverifiability of it all makes faith at all. Again, paradoxically, what gives it its power is that you can't prove it, and yet you trust in it anyway. Anyway, some directing things. Again, I love the lights, just symbolizing that down below are all these patches of happiness. And Homura can now see all the glowing in the world, whereas before all she saw was the drab grays. So too, when she turns around, the red ribbon and the bow featured so prominently. It's such a massive emblem now of her faith and of her trust in Madokami. I think something that's very necessary for the show is to substitute in the evils of the witches with instead the evils of whatever. These could be literally just slimes, right? Dragon Quest slimes. These could be fucking, I don't know, giant transformed beach chairs or something. It doesn't matter. Wraiths are purely the idea that not everything has gone to this paradise, which we've talked about a couple times already in this episode, that Madoka's wish didn't resolve all the ills of human beings because that would deprive people of their free will. So there's still a need to go on fighting, and there's always another battle to fight. This is exactly the same as literally every Magical Girl series. Maybe the characters' journeys end here and somebody else takes up the mantle. Or maybe these characters go on to fight some unique enemy and some unique situation that has little or nothing to do with what they previously experienced. But either way, we've all seen and endured and fought alongside of them, and we know that all those struggles and all those trials and tribulations were indeed meaningful. These fanciful and positive ideas that I've been harping on for so long aren't a panacea. It's not all, as Merlin Mann once said, skylights and ice machines. Instead, it's just that the struggle will never be worthless. If you'll humor me for 2 seconds, I think this is the biggest misconception about the Magical Girl genre. When you see people write about this show or other new shows, or you see the industry chase in the Madoka wake to catch this dark aura, this genre, for as much as it was always about rainbows and cute attacks, was never about purely saccharine and mindless happiness. It's always been a genre that is eternally hopeful in the face of ultimate despair, and about believing in, and in doing so, empowering the values that can reshape our world positively and irrationally. But this is not me preaching at you, it's literally Homura Akemi preaching at you. Listen to what she says.
This world isn't worth saving. Tragedy and sadness will never truly disappear. But even so, it's the place she once tried to protect. I remember that. And I will never, ever forget it. That's why I keep fighting.
And even this is a bit of a questionable translation here. The subtitles more accurately reflect what she says. That is, this irredeemable world may be nothing but a cycle of hatred and sadness. That is, Homura makes less of a value judgment on the world in the Japanese, but hey, the idea of fighting on in the face of absurdity still comes through. It matches very nicely with the directing as she descends here. And I shouldn't have to tell you that coming into this series, already fully understanding what Homura says in this line made this one of the moments again where I definitely still tear up. And the directing here, when she has these giant purple/pink wings, literally invoking Super Sailor Moon's transformation sequence, when it's finally revealed that Homura is granted a weapon, no longer having the shield, because she's not fighting to protect something now. She's fighting in honor of something now. She's fighting of her own volition, having firmly established something that she can truly believe in, wielding now not only the symbol of Madoka's value of self, but also to the symbol of what Madoka sought to act out upon the world as magical girl. Not Madoka's own exact weapon, not just stolen from Madoka, but Homura's interpretation of Madoka's rosewood bow, complete with the flame that we talked about earlier in relation to Homura's name. Once again referencing something that Madoka gave her. Everything in these two scenes is deliberately set up to show Homura as a changed person, informed and emboldened and hardened by the experiences she has been through, now with absolute resolve in her purpose. And that in and of itself is a great place to end the series off and cut away to the credits, with the final version of Connect played over a pure white credits roll. But once again, I am completely blown away by the final post-credits scene of Madoka Magica. It doesn't introduce any new ideas past what we saw in the previous scene, but the representation is just to me still so mind-blowing that I don't understand why anything else has ever managed to be so effective or engaging as this scene. Though it only is there to show Madoka saying keep it up or ganbate to Homura, just simply to reinforce the idea that you are not alone. A quote from Urabuchi states all he wrote was that one line. Inukuri, in fact, added the design for the wings that spout from the back of Homura. And all of that witch symbology, all of that past that Homura recognizes propelling her forward, all the ostensible support of Madoka and every magical girl that goes along with the concept now of hope and purpose and meaning, propelling her to her original destination, the progress that's in the bottom left, and onto another brilliant light somewhere. And Homura's smile at that, that's a special emphasis, and just an absolutely bewildering level of effectiveness in visual storytelling. And then possibly in the least necessary but most effective final act of breaking down the walls between the levels of diegesis, or reflecting this outward onto the genre, we see the 5 girls who constituted this show, their backs, as we zoom out one last time to see in fact their silhouettes, just 5 of an endless line of other magical girls, each with their own stories and pains and triumphs, each who has just as meaningful a story as these 5. They're all out there. They're all out there to be seen and understood and empathized with if you just go look for them. In this year 2021, we already have 2 fantastic magical girl shows that speak as poignantly and as effectively on these values as Madoka Magica does. And I think that's my final plea for Madoka Magica as magical girl show. As the symbol that we talked about in the first segment of the first episode comes to a close and the projector reel stops. The play was over, and in some way that last scene was their curtain call. I hope sincerely that you enjoyed the performance. But clear and sweet, you might say. You've overlooked one crucial thing. I can't believe you haven't talked about the quote that starts this final scene. Well, I say it's deliberate, because I think this is the final place that we should end our talk on Madoka Magica, because for all the 18 hours and year of talking that we've been doing back and forth, I'm not quite sure how it's possible to misinterpret this. It's literally words on the screen in English, not even the native language of this show, but instead the language we're discussing it in. And it has a very clear and very forthright message. I think, though, that there's an intricate balance between two concepts: believing in hope. This, of course, something we see in the previous scene, where Homura says the world isn't worth saving, but I fight on anyway. And then believing in other people, that somehow Homura came to understand this through her interactions with Madoka. And as long as she believes in that relationship, as long as she trusts in Madoka's faith, then she will never and can never fall into despair. We don't see Homo Lily here. We never see Homo Lily, because Homura recognizes and respects that she is not alone. She's never alone. The quote very clearly says always somewhere, regardless of the situation, and that's why this scene is so abstract. It could be anywhere or anything. That doesn't matter. Whatever the circumstances, as long as you trust in what you're doing, as long as you earnestly believe that your actions will have some positive effect on people, then you'll always maintain or create the power and ability to fight through the struggles that come. And it's through and by other people, by recognizing the choices and sacrifices of others, that we can move towards a better future. With magnanimity in your heart and a purpose in mind, you will never find yourself in despair, because that's the eternal and triumphant power of hope. And it's that hope that will never leave you. So don't forget her, or don't take it from me. Take it from the one last gift I have left to give to you. Take it from Homura Akemi.
Don't forget. Always, somewhere, someone is fighting for you. As long as you remember her, you are not alone.
So ends our discussion on Puella Magi Madoka Magica. You have my sincere and heartfelt thank you for coming along with me on this ride. It's one thing to make something, and then it's another thing to not be alone in doing it. I'm currently planning to record a post-mortem on the entire series and recording this over the past year and everything that I learned from doing it, and I think that'll be released on my Patreon. So certainly check that out if you want more information on what I'm doing next. A big project in the works. It's going to be pretty awesome. And my thoughts and progress towards saying something meaningful about rebellion and what shape that's going to take. I sincerely hope that in doing this we've managed to say something interesting that's been useful to you. And until the chance we have to meet again, once all the hurly-burly's done, I do hope you stay tuned. Thank you.